The next step is refining, where synthetic crude oil is processed into gasoline and other things we use every day. Refining is the process of converting crude oil into useful compounds, such as fuel, lubricants, and petrochemicals. Petrochemicals are the building blocks for plastics, fabrics, and other everyday items. Remember earlier we learned that oil sand was 83% sand, 10% bitumen, 4% water, and 3% clay? Well, what happened to the sand, clay, and water? Let's start with the water. We learned earlier that water is used to clean the oil from the sand. And we also learned that through froth treatment, all of the water is removed from the bitumen. Dr. Kim Kaspersky is going to tell us how the water is used and reused as part of the extraction process.
Water plays a really important role in terms of getting the bitumen out of the oil sands. For example, in mined oil sands, it takes anywhere between 10 and 11 barrels of water to produce 1 barrel of bitumen. Now, fortunately, a lot of that water is recycled, but that still means about 3 to 4 barrels of new water has to be used for every barrel of bitumen that is produced. Now, the question is, where does this recycled water come from? Well, for mining operations, after they've extracted the bitumen from this slurry of water and ore, what's left behind is called tailings. And these tailings consist of the water, sand, and clay that came from the original oil sand. Now, these tailings are pumped to specially built tailings ponds where the sand, if nothing else is done to the tailings, settles out very fast. The clay and water move off into the pond, and eventually over years, the clay settles out very slowly, and what you're left on top of the pond is this clear water layer. And that's the water that is recycled back to the extraction process. Now, while it's very good to recycle as much as you can and recover as much water as you can, the chemistry of the water changes each time it goes through the process, and it goes through the process again and again. And every time it goes through that process, more chemicals are added. And that's very important for the operators to know what happens to the water chemistry. What we have done as one of the areas of research here is we build computer models where they can predict what happens to the water. And then using these models, we can see what the effect of mining a new part of the site or doing a tailings treatment where they have to add chemicals, what happens to the water. So they know what will happen in their process. They will know what they have to do to reclaim the water when they finish. So these kind of chemical computer models are a very important tool in looking at the important role that water plays in oil sands development.
The water is recycled, but every time it's reused, it becomes a little more dirty. So it's important to understand the chemistry of the water so that the quality of the water is maintained. But what about the sand and clay? Once the bitumen is removed, the leftovers are called tailings. Very sloppy, muddy stuff stored in large artificial ponds near where the oil sand is mined. Scientists are trying to find a way to get the tailings to become solid so they can be put back onto the landscape. Dr. Randy McCullough is going to demonstrate how this happens.
A lot of the water in the oil sands extraction process is recycled, but there's a significant amount in the wet sand and in the pore spaces of this clay. Right now, the industry uses the wet sand to create a containment area, to create large dikes or ponds to hold this fluid fine tails. Right now, there's approximately 1 billion cubic meters of this fluid fine tails in storage in northern Alberta. The essence of our research program is to solidify this fluid fine tails so that we can start to reclaim the boreal forest. If we remove that water, we're going to reduce the 4 barrels of water per barrel of bitumen down to 2. There's lots of ways to do it. You can imagine we might just dry the material. We can put it in a centrifuge and spin the water out the same way a salad spinner works. But before we do any of those things, we have to have some sort of chemical treatment. If you listen carefully, this sample actually taken from one of the commercial operations, very, very fluid. You can see how easy it is to pour. There's no way we could imagine planting trees on something so fluid. Before we can get the water out, whether it's by drying, centrifugation, techniques we call accelerated dewatering, we have to have some sort of chemical treatment. You heard how fluid this material was. A small amount of chemical treatment. Now we're chemically changing how the clays and the water interact. Now listen carefully. As that chemical dissolves, it goes from something very fluid to something that I can hardly shake, and in fact, something that we can start to think about reclaiming the boreal forest. This chemical treatment is the first step in any of the what we call the dry stackable tailings technologies, whether that be accelerated dewatering, centrifugation, or simply drying.
Wow, we sure have learned a lot of things about oil sands. We know how the bitumen is extracted, how it is cleaned, and how it is upgraded, and finally, how it's refined into fuels and everyday items. We also learned about what happens to the water used in the process and how tailings are being changed into something that can be put back into the environment. Is that where our story ends? No, there's constant research going on at Natural Resources Canada to improve fuels and make the extraction and upgrading processes better and more energy efficient. One new area of research is called bioprocessing. Bioprocessing is the study of using bacteria and enzymes to do the work of high-temperature upgrading. Dr. Heather Detman will explain what bioprocessing is and how it works.
Bioprocesses and biotechnologies are where we're trying to use enzymes and bacteria to do the chemistry that currently are done by other catalysts and high temperature. Athabasca bitumen needs a lot of upgrading once it's been extracted from the oil sands before it can become a diesel or gasoline fuel. In particular, clean burning fuels need to have low sulfur, low oxygen, low heteroatom contents. Current technologies using something like hydrocracking use temperatures over 350 degrees centigrade and 2000 psi hydrogen. So both maintaining that high temperature and those high concentrations of hydrogen end up releasing a lot of CO2 in burning and in production of the hydrogen. So in our biocatalyst group, we're actually looking for low energy catalysts such as enzymes and bacteria to do the same chemistry that happens at the high temperature and with the other catalysts. And so this way, if we can have bacteria take these molecules in and remove the sulfur and oxygen, or have an enzyme like in your detergent remove that carboxyl group, then we'll have a lower environmental impact of upgrading from Athabasca bitumen.
Pretty neat stuff. So instead of using high temperatures, we may be able to use enzymes and bacteria to break apart bitumen molecules and remove sulfur. Research into different types of fuels is also taking place. By examining the smallest parts of a gasoline or diesel fuel, researchers can determine how to alter the chemistry of these fuels to make them cleaner. This scientist is looking at a graphic of a diesel fuel sample, and from this information, he can tell how much sulfur is in the diesel fuel. Now, removing sulfur is important because if a fuel has too much sulfur, it can contribute to air pollution when we drive our vehicles. As we learned earlier, oil and the energy it produces has an important role in our everyday lives. Natural Resources Canada scientists in Devon, Alberta, are working hard to find ways to make the oil sands extraction and upgrading processes more energy efficient and more environmentally sustainable. Through their research, they hope to ensure we will make the best use of our natural resources, protect our environment, and have clean and renewable sources of energy for all Canadians, now and in the future.